Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me for this video, and I hope you're all doing well. So in this video, I'm going to talk about obedience. So how do psychological scientists define obedience? Well, obedience refers to following direct commands from an authority figure, and it's an important part of how societies function. So in many situations, obedience is adaptive and helpful. So for example, think about listening to advice from medical professionals or following emergency protocols during a fire drill or an active shooter drill, or even complying with safe driving laws, right? In all of those cases, obedience is central to the proper functioning of society. But obedience can also become deeply harmful, particularly when the authority figure is misinformed, abusive, or illegitimate. So history gives us several large-scale examples, like wartime atrocities, for example, and psychology provides smaller but more powerful demonstrations. So today we're going to talk about Milgram's obedience studies, and we're also going to talk about real-world incidences like the strip search hoax, where people followed harmful instructions from a fake police officer. So today's lecture will explore why obedience is such a strong social force, the conditions that increase or decrease obedience, what Milgram discovered with his research, and how modern research and real cases show that these pressures to submit to authority and obey orders are still very much at work in contemporary society. So any discussion of obedience really has to begin with the case of Adolf Eichmann. So Adolf Eichmann was a high-ranking Nazi official who played a central role in organizing the logistics of the Holocaust. As the head of Jewish affairs within the SS, he coordinated the identification, deportation, and mass transport of millions of Jews to ghettos and concentration camps. After World War II, he fled to Argentina, but was captured by Israeli agents in 1960 and brought to Jerusalem for trial. His defense was that he was merely following orders, and this idea became infamous and sparked widespread discussion of obedience, responsibility, and the banality of evil, a phrase popularized by philosopher Hannah Arendt to describe how ordinary individuals can perpetrate horrific crimes through unquestioning compliance and obedience to authority. So the testimony of Adolf Eichmann was one of the motivating forces for Stanley Milgram. So Stanley Milgram, motivated by questions about obedience after World War II, designed a study to test how far ordinary people would go when instructed by an authority figure. So participants in Milgram's famous experiment arrived believing they were in a study on learning and memory. And they drew slips that either assigned them to be a teacher or a learner. But the slips were rigged so that all of the participants were given the role of teacher, while a confederate or actor working for the experimenter was designated as the learner. So the role of the teacher for all of the participants was to watch the learner get strapped into a shocking apparatus, and they were told that shocks could be painful but not dangerous. And so in a separate room, the teacher's job was to read word pairs and deliver a shock every time the Confederate made an error. So they would be given a cue like ball, and the answer was trap or train or something like that. And every time the teacher or the participant delivered a shock, the Confederate gave an incorrect answer. And when the Confederate gave an incorrect answer, the participant was instructed to give the Confederate a shock. So in a separate room, the participant read word pairs and delivered a shock for every error that the Confederate made, increasing the voltage from mild to potentially lethal levels. So the learner's responses would include grunts, protests, complaints about heart trouble, and eventual silence. Now, because the learner was a Confederate working for the experimenter, all of these responses were pre-recorded and not real. However, when teachers hesitated to deliver the shock to what they thought was an actual person, the experimenter used standardized prompts like, please continue, or the experiment requires that you continue. Despite sweating, trembling, or protesting, most participants continued to shock the learner even when the size of the shock was increased to what they thought were potentially lethal levels. And 2/3 of the participants went on to deliver the highest shock. And so Milgram concluded that ordinary people like Adolf Eichmann can engage in harmful behavior when directed to do so by an authority, even when it conflicts with their values. So in Milgram's own published reports and later interviews, he noted that some participants showed extreme signs of emotional distress, including trembling, sweating, uncontrollable nervous laughter, and in a few rare cases, seizure-like episodes. So Milgram described one participant who had what he called a full-blown uncontrollable seizure, and others who showed lesser but still convulsive reactions. So he explained these episodes as having occurred during moments of intense conflict, when participants wanted to stop shocking the learner, but felt compelled to obey the experimenter at all costs. So Milgram found that obedience wasn't fixed. It changed depending on the situation. So, for example, obedience increased when the authority figure was physically close to the participant, when he appeared legitimate, for example, so when he wore a lab coat or when he was associated with a prestigious institution like Harvard or Yale. And obedience rates also rose when the participant felt less personally responsible, such as when someone else administered the shocks for the participant. Obedience dropped sharply when the authority figure gave orders by phone, when participants saw others disobey, or when the learner was physically closer or required more direct contact, making the harm harder to ignore. These variations showed that obedience is highly sensitive to context, and even small changes in social pressure or perceived responsibility can shift people either toward compliance with authority or resistance. Experiment was conducted in the 1950s and 60s, which was obviously a long time ago. So a natural question is whether we would see similar results were the experiment conducted today. Well, unsurprisingly, some of the methods that Milgram used would be considered unethical today, particularly given the significant distress to the participants. So we have replicated or extended Milgram's results with some ethical modifications. So most notably, in 2009, Jerry Berger conducted a partial replication approved under modern ethical standards. So he used rigorous screening of participants to exclude highly vulnerable participants who might suffer from anxiety or epilepsy or may have had interactions with the criminal justice system, for example. He also emphasized to participants that they could withdraw from the experiment anytime without pressure, and he stopped the procedure at 150 volts, which is the point in Milgram's study when most participants first started to show strong stress responses. And what he found is that even with these ethical modifications and these safeguards in place, obedience levels were strikingly similar to Milgram's original findings. So about 70% of participants were still willing to continue shocking the Confederate even past 150 volts. So there have been additional replications, for example, across different cultures using virtual reality or with simulated tasks that avoid the stress that was typical of Milgram's original study. And they found comparable patterns of obedience. So many people will comply with authority even when they feel uncomfortable. And while the exact procedure cannot be ethically repeated today, modified replications consistently support Milgram's basic conclusion that obedience to authority is a powerful and widespread force. To end this video by telling you guys about an event that occurred in the early 2000s that was remarkably similar to the Milgram obedience study and has striking implications. So in the early 2000s, a disturbing hoax swept across dozens of fast food restaurants, mostly in small towns. So a caller posing as a police officer would phone the restaurant and calmly explain that an employee was suspected of theft and instruct the manager to help with an on-site investigation. Because the caller sounded authoritative, using real police terminology, providing fake badge numbers, and even referencing real local police officers, most managers complied. So what followed was astonishing. Employees were ordered to search coworkers' belongings, then to remove their clothing, and in some cases to detain, strip search, or physically restrain them. And these investigations sometimes lasted hours with the caller escalating requests kind of step by step, very similar to the way that Milgram's shocks escalated in severity. And many people who complied later said they were terrified of disobeying someone they believed was in law enforcement. The scam only stopped after an investigation revealed more than 70 similar incidents nationwide. In one of the most extreme and widely publicized cases, at a McDonald's in Mount Washington, Kentucky, the caller manipulated staff into detaining and strip searching a young female employee for hours. During the call, the perpetrator instructed the manager to bring in another adult to continue the search, which eventually escalated into sexual assault. The case led to criminal charges, a trial, and a civil lawsuit against the corporation of McDonald's. It remains one of the strongest real world examples of how far obedience to perceived authority can be pushed, especially when combined with isolation, stress, and a believable chain of command.